The embassy in D.C., the Venezuelan embassy in D.C., has fallen. As you know, embassy protectors had been there for over 30 days trying to prevent fake ambassador Carlos Vecchio from taking the embassy over. They lasted over 30 days. But in what has been called a breach of international law, agents entered the embassy and arrested the people involved. Let's talk about this, because for some reason this feels like a loss to me, and I'm saying this feels like a loss personally to me. I covered this story, and in covering this story, I rooted for those protectors. And so it saddens me to see that they were pulled out. By the same token, I applaud the resistance that they've shown. Let's get into the story. Yesterday, Code Pink sent word that the protectors who were in the embassy were arrested, and they made the point that this was a breach of international law. Fake ambassador Carlos Vecchio celebrated this, of course, in addition to the sycophants that were around applauding them. There were several pro-coup people that were involved in this process. What we know at this point is that at 9:30 on the 16th, police officers illegally entered the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. in Georgetown neighborhood and arrested 4 activists lawfully living in the building since April 10th as guests of the legitimate Venezuelan government. Now, in order to smoke them out, they went from everything to turning off electricity. They turned off electricity. They stopped food from getting into the embassy. It took Jesse Jackson, yes, that Jesse Jackson, to deliver food to the embassy. Otherwise, they were being starved to death. And not to death, but you know what I mean. They were trying to smoke them out. The embassy was under siege. This gentleman is Alex Rubinstein. Several people have been following the story. Anya Pampero have been really good on the story. Blumenthal, Norton. Pampero was even in the building itself. This was a rally that took place afterwards as people were discussing this and showing their frustration about what was taking place. This gentleman is extraordinarily bright. I listened to this guy give a dissertation or give a speech on Russian history. It's utterly fascinating. Listen to his speech here. Listen to what he's saying. And I want to wrap this back around to the argument that lefties are making about this is a severe breach of international law. And I want to make the counterpoint that there is no such thing as international law. And for whatever reason, I feel myself getting slightly annoyed with this continued invocation of such a thing that doesn't exist. It's like screaming about unicorns. Let's take a listen to.
Today was a gross violation of international law and U.S. law. The Vienna Convention is a signed treaty. That means it's the highest law of the land for the United States. The Vienna Convention states clearly in Article 22 that this compound, this diplomatic building, is inviolable, meaning it cannot be seized. Today it was seized. It was seized by Secret Service, by U.S. Marshals, by Metropolitan Police Department, in a military-style operation against peaceful people who have been inside the Venezuelan embassy as the invited guests of the government of Venezuela. This is clearly the first time that anything like this has happened in U.S. history. Even during the U.S.-sponsored Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961, it did not occur to the U.S. government at that time to seize the Cuban embassy and turn it over to the opposition. The Vienna Convention exists to protect diplomats everywhere. There will be a cascading impact. There will be a blowback based on this lawlessness. This is Mike Pompeo. This is John Bolton, who have hijacked U.S. foreign policy to engage in imperial designs, breaking international law. What's the real goal? The real goal is to support a coup that has failed. This coup has failed because the people in Venezuela don't want it. It failed on January 23rd. It failed on February 23rd. It failed on April 30th. 80% of the people of Venezuela, whether they support or don't support the Maduro government, oppose any U.S. intervention into their country because they, like all people, want to be the masters of their own destiny. For our part, we're going to continue. On Saturday, there will be a massive demonstration here. People are coming from all over the United States to say we still stand with the Embassy Protection Collective. You have jailed the Embassy Protection Collective, but you haven't stopped the movement, our movement that supports the right of the people of Venezuela to self-determination. Thank you very much.
And just to be clear, that is what this is about. I've at no point mentioned Maduro in this conversation. The issue is straightforward. Should the affairs of Venezuela be for the people of Venezuela? The answer is yes. The answer is extremely yes. What the United States is doing is extraordinary. It is using a financial crisis. And you might say that there was corruption. You might say they were mismanaged. Fair enough. But we ourselves hit a financial crisis in 2008, but we didn't have a superpower standing on our throat, preventing us from getting up. And what we're seeing is the United States using its financial dominance to essentially use sanctions to try to collapse the government that it doesn't like, with this goal of getting its hands on the resources of Venezuela. Now, do you honestly believe Pompeo, Bolton, Abrams, Trump are really looking at this with regards to the best interests of the people of Venezuela? And as a secondary question, do you think the United States should be able to use its dominance of the world of sorts in order to dictate who is the leader and the government of various nations around the world? The United States chose, talked to, spoke with, working in the sense of a coup, working with the opposition in order to try to get the opposition to take power by creating as much havoc and chaos in the government as possible. Tell me this. Do you think that the opposition has more or less of an incentive of negotiating with the government when it has a superpower backing it? And the sad part is, it seems that the superpower was the only thing backing it because he had no public support for what they were trying to accomplish. Even if you dislike Maduro, you can think Maduro is a horrible guy. It is a secondary question on whether or not it is the United States' responsibility to topple the government of that nation. And understand the method by which we are using to do this is by investing resources into the hands of essentially people creating chaos and havoc. And not just investing resources, sanctions. Those sanctions have killed up to 40,000 Venezuelans. Sanctions are an act of war. They kill in Iraq. Bill Clinton's sanctions killed over 500,000 kids in Iraq. Is it our responsibility? My point is, no, it's not our responsibility to do it. Even if Maduro's a bad guy, it is for the Venezuelans to make that choice. And what I would guarantee you is that the Venezuelans, even though a lot has been said about them in their name in mainstream media, in no way supports the United States dictating the government of Venezuela or choosing the government of Venezuela. Do you understand that if this was any other country, if Guaido was in any other country, this would be treason and he would be put in prison for this? He is literally working with a foreign power to usurp the government of this country. And this is all taking place while in this country, there's been a conspiracy theory that the Russian government was somehow working with Donald Trump. And even beyond that conspiracy theory, that Russia intervened into our political affairs with Facebook and Twitter ads. That was an attack on democracy itself. But what we're doing in Venezuela, bipartisan, by the way, has nothing to do with Maduro. It has everything to do with what we do with our might. We are openly threatening a nation with military force, with this notion of getting rid of their governments. And by the way, what we're doing is trying to splinter the military away from Maduro. You understand that this creates the pretext for civil war. Has nothing to do with Maduro. It has everything to do with what we are doing in this country and the havoc we're causing in other countries. The affairs of Venezuelans are for the people of Venezuela. It is not for us. That was an entire point of what Code Pink was doing. The last two last points. Code Pink would make this argument that the reason why they went into the buildings had to do with stopping Carlos Vecchio from getting in. That part's true. But I would argue that the excuse that Code Pink gave is a little bit more visceral than the logical argument that is being made. When I saw this, I was bothered by this. Now, I wasn't even there and I was bothered by this. I was bothered by this because I followed the story. And I see what the United States is doing. And it comes across as overtly predatory in regards to the behavior that the United States is acting. It's overt predatory. It's not like it was in the past where a government will fall in South America and it would be like, oh, wow, that's interesting that the government fell. And there was no prints on it. The CIA was able to work through, subversive means in order to accomplish their objectives. This is overt. This is so over the top. And at this point, it has utterly failed. I strongly would suggest that the motivation for Code Pink was less about stopping Vecchio from getting the embassy. That's true. But there's a strong part of that was resistance. Just blunt resistance. And not resistance from the standpoint of trying to usurp this, an issue that's for the Venezuelans. This is an overtly American issue because it is us that's doing it. They looked at this process and I would wager they said and they felt what I feel, what a lot of people feel. God, I want to be able to do something, but I as one person can't do anything. I can't change this process. And it is true that those people being there for that month is the hardships that these guys had to endure. It is true that they're being moved and they're being pushed away from this. By the same token, they were able to stand there and resist what was essentially an empire and a machine and give one statement of resistance that I am against my government doing this. I don't agree with my government doing this. We're doing bad things. And in the process of doing bad things, I want to, at the very least, as insignificant as this is in the larger context of what is taking place directly in Venezuela, I want to, at the very least, show that there are some people in this country that is completely, outright, diametrically opposed to the position of the U.S. government in this regard. I would imagine it was that impulse, because I strongly suspect that impulse is in a lot of people who would want to be able to do something. And in this case, they found the means to be able to be a toothpick in the paw of the eagle. The last point I want to make on this, international law. I had several people send me emails on this. Shout out to HB, shout out to Jeff Kuntz. And one of the points they made was, look, this breaks the Vienna Convention. And they went further. I saw Andrea. They went further into showing the aspects of the law and so forth that this was breaking. And I understand why they do it. Because there's something to be said about having a standard by which you can judge behavior by and say, wait a minute, this is running afoul of something. But I would put to you that international law doesn't exist. And I got to be honest. I'm getting to the point where I'm slightly annoyed by hearing international law. Because at a certain point, we have to acknowledge it doesn't exist. And I would even go further. Acknowledging that it doesn't exist at the very least allows people to take the blinders off their eyes that they're living in some kind of orderly world where countries behave in somewhat fair means with regards to one another. That's nonsense. You have some nations that are subjected to what they would call law, and you have other nations in which it doesn't matter, in which it seems to not apply at all, which means that what you have is selective justice, which is not justice at all. If it doesn't apply to everybody, how is it a law? And not just that, if you can't discharge justice when somebody breaches that law and runs afoul of it, then how do you call it a law at all? I'm making the point that what we're considering the international law seem to be just suggestions. Where was the international law when George Bush goes into a country and decimates a country with this notion of weapons of mass destruction, something, by the way, that was a conspiracy theory. Where's international law when these guys are squeezing Venezuela in this way to get their hands on the resources, openly predatory behavior? What about Iran? Unilaterally pulling from an agreement and then squeezing Iran with sanctions. And then the moment that Iran says, we're going to start back in Richmond because nobody is living up to this agreement, then it's, how dare you? And everybody forgets the fact that the United States was the one that originally pulled out and was the one that propagated this crisis. Where's international law in this regard? Where? I don't see it. What about Syria? Putting weapons in the hands of terrorists in order to get them to destabilize another government. What about Libya? They're selling slaves in Libya. You could buy a slave for cheaper than you could buy a car in the United States. Just ride the back of the slave everywhere you go. Where's international law in these cases? I don't see it. What about Yemen? The United States is assisting Saudi Arabia in killing and massacring human beings. It is openly, completely agreed upon, without any controversy in the least, the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet right now. Where's international law? Where? We don't even follow our own laws on this. Go back and look at Tulsi Gabbard's cross-examination of Mattis, where she's asking him, how on earth are you guys firing these missiles off at these countries that haven't attacked us? Where is the congressional authority? What are you using in order to do these things? When George Bush was torturing people, that is against our laws. And he admits to it. We're looking forward. We're not looking back. But breathlessly, every Democrat tells me how Trump needs to be impeached. One guy is responsible for the death of 1 million people. And by the way, I leave it here, but not just responsible for the death of 1 million people. You understand that the attacks on the Middle Eastern countries created a flood of refugees that not only was responsible for ISIS, but also for the refugee crisis in Europe. That the destabilization of Europe politically was in large response for the refugees that was flooding into Europe. That's an issue of foreign policy. That's Europe going in line with the U.S. foreign policy, having, you could say, adverse consequences. Think about that for a moment, though. The breaking up of the European Union may in part be because of the foreign policy of the European nations that are a part of that European Union being patsy nations of the United States. While we were spending $1 trillion a year, China was investing in AI. It was investing in their roads, houses. They were essentially dealing with, and by no means am I saying, this is necessarily a great place to live, but I'm just kind of making this difference between, we were spending trillions. We are $22 trillion in debt. One war after the next, being policemen of the world. And even now, we still continue to do such things. Where does international law apply? If a podunk African dictator killed 100,000 people, they would have dragged his ass before The Hague. George Bush kills upwards of 1 million, spends trillions of dollars to do it, and he's fingerprinting. Explain to me this thing of international law. Explain to me this thing of international law. My contention is that it doesn't exist. If something says dogs are not allowed in this particular area and you have a place full of dogs, or better yet, if someone says smoking is not allowed and it's against the law and people are smoking up right in front of the sign, then the sign is somewhat nonsense. How can you call something a law if it's openly flouted? And not just openly flouted, even if somebody did care, there was no means in which to discharge any level of authority. How is that a law? How is that a law? I'm sorry, international law does not exist. It is used for selective justice in order to subjugate some nations while letting other nations do what they want. In what capacity? What could possibly France, the United States, Germany, what could any of these nations do that would get condemnation in a way that there would be some actual penalties? And who would do it? Take out the other countries for the moment. The United States. What possibly could the United States? The United States right now is in open hostilities with the entire world. You don't believe me? Even with our allies. We're trying to stop a pipeline That's taking place in Germany right now. That's not going to go anywhere. We're trying to do the same thing in the UK with Huawei. We're trying to go after China in regards to the trade deal because we don't like the fact that they've been able to economically develop in this kind of blitzkrieg way. We're going after Russia and the standpoint of Russiagate because the Democratic Party lost an election and can't get over the fact that they lost an election, so they went into conspiracy theory and fantasies. But they demonized Russia the entire time, creating an adverse condition to having anything done legitimately to bring the countries closer together. Iran, squeezing them, trying to change the government of that country, with John Bolton, a mad dog of sorts, a psychopath, saying he was going to be celebrating in Tehran in 2019. But Donald Trump put that guy to lead the squeezing of that country. Same thing with Venezuela. Open hostilities with North Korea. And in each of these cases, we're trying to get them to do something that they can't possibly do. Almost as if the United States wants to show an act of dominance with a world that is telling it to kick rocks. A man in a country killed 1 million people or was responsible for 1 million people. 0 consequences. Why don't those lives matter? And if you can kind of point that out of saying, well, it's against international law to murder people, what is this? How's that flouted in that way? How does that matter? When France, the United States, and Britain decides to go it alone and to kill Gaddafi's people, to allow these guys to flood in and create essentially gangs and so forth. Who's responsible for that? Why is there no consequence for that? How are they allowed to make decisions like that completely ignore international law? And then you ask the secondary question, well, maybe international law doesn't exist. If it continues to be ignored in this way, maybe it doesn't exist. My contention is it does not exist. And people would be better off looking at it that way, because that's a more terrifying world. That's a world of nations that are essentially vultures and predators. And what matters is the most power that you can get with a particular nation to keep those nations off of you. And this is kind of the secret with China and why this is such a terrifying prospect. Because China is not accepting any level of dominance from the United States from the standpoint of economics. And they're not changing their economic model to suit U.S. interests, which creates friction. This friction has been taking place. We've gotten to the point where we're trying to sanction other nations for using Chinese products. What international law? What international law? I'll end this here. This video went longer than I wanted, but I just wanted to nail that point home. You can't tell me that international law exists if people don't follow international law. And if there's no way to discharge a justice if that law has been broken. If that case, let's stop talking about international law. And in this case, you have to deal with reality the way it is. These things are about power, how to get the most power and how to fight back or thwart countries that are superpowers that may be preying on your assets. That's the conversation. That's the interesting question. That's one of resistance. But international law would not protect you. It would not save you. And unicorns do not exist. Thanks all. If you enjoyed the content, please like, share, and if you really enjoy, you find yourself coming back often, please consider supporting through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all.